Greetings, dear colleagues. This is Smart Geopolitics. I'm your host, Akov Gabrilan, and today we have a very special guest, Pietro Shakarian, who is PhD candidate in Russian history at the Ohio State University. Pietro, thank you very much for joining us today. And the first questions that I want to ask you related to your professional field of interest is that how would you assess the Soviet part of Armenian history, speaking geopolitically, speaking economically, speaking socially?
Well, the Soviet part of Armenian history, it's not so clean-cut as, many people make it out to be. So for a lot of people in Armenia who are of the older generation, Soviet times, they were absolutely the best times, and this is almost like a rose-tinted glasses point of view that's affected by the idea, that during the Brezhnev era, before kind of the Zastoy, before kind of the stagnation period, there was a lot of it was a more prosperous time. There were goods, people were living well, people had jobs, and this is what people look at. On the other end of that, you have a rise since the end of the Soviet Union in Armenia of Armenian nationalist ideology and this idea of that the Soviet Union was bad and that there was nothing good from the Soviet Union and that it was all basically one whole period of Stalinism, which is not true because there are different variations of the Soviet history. From the NEP period in the 1920s to Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev and then to Gorbachev. This whole period, there's a dramatic difference between Gorbachev's Soviet Union and Stalin's Soviet Union. But some of the narratives that have emerged in the post-Soviet space since the end of the Soviet Union have tried to cast the Soviet Union as one authoritarian monolith, which isn't true. So my task as a historian is to look through these narratives and try to get the objective image.
When we talk about the Soviet Union and particularly the Armenia's history in the Soviet Union, don't you think that we should separate these two things? One thing is economic development, the other thing is social relationship. For Armenia particularly and for some other states which were members of the Soviet Union, this whole 70-year period was not just black and white, as you very rightly mentioned, but it was a more complex picture, and in that sense, maybe we as political scientists, as historians, should look at the picture entirely, not cherry picking only negativity or only positivity from the Soviet past.
Right, and I think also too. I have a podcast on Russian history. I interviewed this researcher on Ukrainian history, Helena Mokrushina, and she was saying to me how unfortunately, since the end of the Soviet Union, a lot of the positive legacies have been tapered over, specifically in Ukraine, because she was telling me about Ukraine, the decommunization laws and this sort of a thing.
Right.
And she was saying to me about that, how Ukrainians felt when the Soviet Union collapsed that, we're losers, that nothing good came out of the Soviet period because in the end it failed. And so...
Why do you think we have another tendency now? Because there is a kind of very proliferated, very widespread thing now to heavily criticize the Soviet past, especially from the post-Soviet states. Those governments that are currently in power in some post-Soviet states, they hugely criticize the Soviet past. They want to cut all the ties which are related of their country with the Soviet past. Why do you think this tendency exists?
Well, I think that's on two tracks. I think there's the first track is the sense of that the Soviet Union failed, the socialist experiment failed. So because there's this perception that it failed, and I think actually these questions of failure and success, these are terms that are kind of problematic from a historian's point of view. I don't necessarily endorse the idea that it failed. I think that basically in the end, the regime, didn't work. The regime collapsed. The state dissolved itself for various reasons. But to say, measuring success or failure is a difficult question because in some ways there are a lot of things that did, quote unquote, succeed that you still see to this day. There are legacies of the Soviet Union. You can't erase that. But what I want to say is on one end, people perceive that it failed because when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, when it dissolved in 1991, there was an idea that the state, that the socialist idea, this ideology, this failed. So that's one thing.
But still,
the other thing is the second track is the nationalism. That there is a certain movement among some post-Soviet states, such as Georgia, Ukraine, even Armenia, that they associate the Soviet Union with Russian imperialism or some sort of negative influence of Russia, and they want to cut this, negative influence completely. They can't. There's this idea among Armenian nationalists or Georgian nationalists or Ukrainian nationalists, we don't want anything to do with Russia, that sort of a thing. But on the first level, too, this perception of failure, you even see that in Russia itself. Criticisms of Lenin, criticisms of the Soviet past, this sort of a thing.
Yeah, but this criticism in Russia, particularly, it is not completely equal to the extent of criticism which we witness in other post-Soviet states, and that's why I particularly wanted to know your opinion whether we can consider it as a criticism not only of the Soviet history, of the Soviet legacy, but also as a huge share of criticism against current Russia and current Russian policies. Do you think there are any connections, any ties between criticism of the Soviet history and criticism against current Russia?
I think this is an interesting. I think again, this is tied to nationalism, and I think this question is directly associated in many ways with the geopolitical contest, if you will, between Russia and the West. Because I think the United States, unfortunately, the Western countries, through smaller NGOs, through NGOs in these countries, have encouraged a certain kind of anti-Russian discourse that not only rejects the Soviet past, but rejects any sort of Russian legacy, that anything to do with Russia is bad. And especially because there's a perception that Putin in the early 2000s, as he came to power and began kind of cracking down on some of the oligarchs, I mean, there are many oligarchs he co-opted, but then he began cracking down on some others, that there was a perception that he was reconsolidating his control over the post-Soviet space. I think yes, I think he is to some extent, but we have to understand why. I think that this isn't just some bold this isn't just a raw imperialistic move. There's always been the tendency for regional cooperation in the post-Soviet space since even the Soviet Union collapsed. We have to think, why do we have a Commonwealth of Independent States? Even there was this idea that Gorbachev was voicing. I mean, he had the idea of the New Union Treaty in 1991, but he was also voicing this idea of creating like an EU-style federation of post-Soviet countries. So this idea had been in the air for a while. It's not just Putin. This is something that's always been in the air in the post-Soviet space, and we shouldn't just think of it as just a Russian project or even a Russian imperial project. This is something that's a natural development that occurs among states who share very common features. And the post-Soviet space, the post-Soviet countries all share common experiences. For instance, the privatization in the 1990s. It happened very similar in Armenia as it happened in Russia. Then in addition, you have oligarchs. I mean, you have these different kind of dynamics. You also have the common shared experience of the common state. So there are all sorts of commonalities that I could go on and on talking about, but it just is natural that these states would cooperate. And actually, for the security of the world, I think that that's actually better. I would say that that's better for the security of, say, the United States or Canada or the European countries, that the post-Soviet countries work closer together.
How would you explain this phenomena? The phenomena that it is largely the foreign policy agenda that sometimes dictates how to perceive Russia, how to approach Russia, how to even scientifically research Russia.
Well, I think that, first of all, we have to understand, I mean, in academia, actually, my opinion isn't that unpopular as you might think. There are a lot of academics, the majority of American academics, serious American academics who study Russia, would agree that the post-Soviet space, post-Soviet countries, they all share commonalities, and that cooperation among them would be the best thing. But many of them are afraid to speak out because the mainstream media, the coverage on Russia is so intensely negative, and it's so intensely focused on Putin, which I think is a very huge oversimplification of Russian politics. Because it's not just all about Putin. It's about, there's an internal politics in Russia that many Western commentators don't understand, and it's very clear they don't understand it. So I came away with a more balanced view of Russia, in part, in large part, thanks to my dad, but also due to my own research, due to my own conclusions. And also, especially during the Ukrainian crisis, initially, I was actually more supportive of Armenia signing the association agreement with the EU. But then, if you look into the issue closely enough, you also begin to think to yourself, well, why would Armenia do this when many of these EU countries have major economic problems like Greece, Spain, Italy, this sort of a thing, that the EU needs to focus on those countries and getting its own house united, because right now it's very divided.
Right.
To get their own house in order before they can expand to include any countries. And then I also saw, the uglier face of this kind of pro-Western movement, which was in Ukraine, and the way in which extreme nationalists were co-opted into the Euromaidan movement, which started out as more of a liberal movement, but then they brought in these like neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, and I knew, who these groups were because I had actually looked at Ukrainian politics on my own independently. So I knew Svoboda, I knew groups like this, and as soon as I saw their insignias on the square in Kiev, I thought to myself, well, this is not good. Ethically, this is wrong.
So you actually anticipated my question, because the question I was going to ask was, you see any similarities between the happenings of Armenia, the so-called Velvet Revolutions that happened in April this year, and this whole Ukrainian situation, which began in autumn 2014, and still it goes on. Do you see any similarities between these revolutions, or maybe any differences?
Well, I think that I'll tell you, let's start with similarities. I think that the similarities are pretty much, why was the population mobilized in Ukraine to support the Maidan? Why was the population in Armenia mobilized to support the so-called Velvet Revolution or April Revolution or whatever you call the Nikol Pashinyan Revolution? I think that on that level, you're looking at the collapse of the Soviet state, the dissolution of the Soviet state, and all the problems associated with that, all the socioeconomic problems, the lack of jobs, the poverty, all these issues have led people, and the corruption is number one, actually, how this has led all these people to go out on the streets and protest in both cases.
So now, the roots were the same.
The roots were the same, I would say. And people also at the same time, when you look at, in the case of Ukraine, many people also believed, in my opinion, naively, that the EU would be the magic bullet that would solve all these problems.
So the means were different. It is the means that were different.
But I think the means were different. Also, the objectives were different. And I think also key to the whole thing, I think in the Armenian case, you had, first of all, we're going to transition to differences. In the Armenian case, you had liberals who were primarily leading the revolution. You didn't have nationalist figures. In fact, Nikol Pashinyan excluded groups like, let's say, the Daredevils of Sassoon group. Whereas in Ukraine, those sort of radical nationalists and far-right, fascists were embraced as part of the coalition.
But right now, if I'm not mistaken, the Daredevils of Sassoon, as you say, or Sasnatsarer, as it is said in Armenia, they are now very strong, already political power, which tries to gain some votes, which is gaining its momentum gradually, and it one day can become a part of the national parliament. And as you say, they are very nationalistic force. So how would you address this issue?
Well, I would say that the difference fundamentally on that front is that, and I also want to get to geopolitics too, so let's not forget that. The difference fundamentally is that they're not part of the governing coalition. Nikol Pashinyan, first of all, commands such popularity in Armenia that he could win his party without even being part of this Yelp coalition. The civil contract could win the whole parliament, or could win the majority of the parliament easily. You saw, for instance, in the Yerevan mayoral election, how Nikol's candidate won that election by a very, very strong margin. So I see that if we have parliamentary elections, that's what's going to happen. I think civil contract is going to win very, very big. But I think when you look at the case of the Daredevils of Sassoon, this group, as I say, I don't think this group this group will have a following. It will maybe have representation in parliament, but it's not going to be part of the ruling coalition, nor was it part of the coalition that led the revolution itself. This is a key difference versus Ukraine, where these guys, the right sector, were brought into the coalition of the government. Svoboda was brought into the coalition of the government. I mean, these are guys who, worship Bandera, Stepan Bandera, who was a Ukrainian collaborator with the Nazi Germany, and also who participated in the slaughter of Ukrainian Jews at, for instance, Babi Yar. So there's a difference because those that in Ukraine, the liberals and the people leading the revolution welcomed the far right into their coalition, but Nikol rejected such a coalition. And the other thing I want to mention, though, too, really quick, geopolitics. The Ukrainian revolution was expressly anti-Russian. I mean, you can tell me it's pro-EU or whatnot, but the ambition about going into NATO, the idea of, being anti-Putin, being
it was not the case in Yerevan, in Armenia.
In Yerevan, it was very, very cautious. Nikol Pashinyan and his team understood at some point that being anti-Russian is actually dangerous. There was a trend in Armenian politics for many years that many commentators endorsed, unfortunately in Armenia, that it was good to be anti-Russian. Right? You had, for instance, Rafi Hovhannisyan coming in, and he was against Armenia joining the Eurasian Customs Union, and at the same time, he also was claiming, parts of Western Armenia and Turkey. And I don't know how Armenia could survive with a policy like that. Very unpragmatic, very nationalistic. But those anti-Russian moods were very much in the air, and they were very damaging, I think, in many respects. Even some of the people now in the government, of Pashinyan's government, used to be very, very vocally anti-Russian. Right? So this is kind of another issue, but at the end of the day, Nikol himself is very, very balanced in terms of how he approaches this foreign policy issue. But it's expressly different, I would say, than the Maidan. This is not cannot be compared to Maidan, but the only similarity, I would say, is the socioeconomic reasons why people went out to protest to begin with.
So in that respect, I believe what helped Nikol Pashinyan to succeed is that he was flexible and he understood that at the level of political party you can have your own narrow political agenda, but when you come an incumbent at a presidential or prime ministerial office, you should definitely broaden your political interest. You should definitely embrace not only the interest of your political party, but the interest of state. And the interest of Armenian state is to have very positive relationship with its geographically far and close neighbors, including and especially Russia. That is why it's not, I think, it's not an exception that in one of his very recent speeches, Nikol Pashinyan particularly stressed that the Russian military base that is now located in Armenia, it's one of the guarantors of the Armenian national security. When we talk about the Russian military presence in Armenia, it is not only the question of Russian geopolitical interests exercised in the region of the South Caucasus, but also a very vital and vocal question of Armenian statehood in general, because we have Turkey with very harsh relationship. We basically have no diplomatic relationship with Turkey. We have a state of semi-war or semi-ceasefire with Azerbaijan, and to a certain extent we can affirm that this Russian military presence in the region helps Armenia approach these challenges to a certain extent. How do you feel about it?
I think it's suicide to get rid of the Russian base in Armenia. That's, like you say, guarantor of Armenian security. And I think at the end of the day, the majority of Armenian people across the board, across the political spectrum, across the political divides, agree that this is actually a stupid idea to withdraw Russia from Armenia. That being said, I also want to throw in another point about why this revolution is important, why the geopolitical context, the absence of the geopolitical context is important. Because if Armenia focuses on domestic developments as a post-Soviet country, that could set a good precedent for other post-Soviet countries. It can be a possible pathway to reform. It presents a possible alternative where a so-called revolution in these post-Soviet states, a so-called velvet revolution, I should say, does not lead to mass chaos or war or, NATO versus Russia or that country becoming a geopolitical chess piece in the middle of a big superpower game. That in the end, it sets an example of reform for other post-Soviet countries, including in Central Asia, including in the Caucasus, all over the place, including in Ukraine, including even in Russia. So Armenian reformers in many ways are very smart to keep this based in the post-Soviet space and not leaving the post-Soviet space, because it's impossible to remove those connections with Russia that have existed for 70 years, that have existed for 200 years. and instead to use those connections to your advantage to show how you could be an example to others in the region. And that, I think, is a much more universalistic view. And that's why I think the Armenian Revolution in the long term is going to be much more successful.
Pietro, thank you very much for your time and opinion. I remind we had Pietro Shakarian, who is a scholar from Ohio State University. Thank you very much again, Pietro. This was Smart Geopolitics. I was your host, Jacob Gabrilan. We'll see each other very soon. Don't forget to subscribe on our page in Facebook.